I'm Michael Nash, the director of the Tenement Library, and I want to welcome everybody here today for a program organized by Robert Cohn on Historians, Power, and Politics, Jesse Lemisch Classic Critique of Anti-Radicalism, the American Historical Association, or Profession, 1969. When Robbie first mentioned this program to me, I actually had struck a dim memory, because at the very first AHA meeting that I was as a first-year graduate student, I remember Jesse talking about this critique. I don't remember where, and it must have been '69, because that's when I was a first-year graduate student. So it brought back those memories, which are from a long time ago. Again, I just want to welcome everybody here, and I guess is Ravi. We didn't choreograph this too well, but I assume that Ravi is sort of following. Sure. To tell us more about the program.
Sure. I'm just going to introduce the session, and then I'm going to hand it over to Blanche Cook, who's going to chair our panel. Then the panelists will all speak, and then there'll be some time at the end for discussion. Okay. This panel is sponsored by NYU's Department of Teaching and Learning and the Department of Education's History in the Classroom project as part of a partnership that connects public school history teachers to historians and to innovative scholarship that can help them bring history to life in the classroom. I'd like to thank Anne-Marie Weathers of the Department of Education. Anne-Marie, is she here? Yes. Why don't you stand up for a second, Anne-Marie? Thank you. Yes. She's, I think, the best social studies and history leader in the Department of Education by far. I'd also like to, for the teachers, could you stand for a second and just let's welcome the teachers to NYU? Come on. Okay. Great. You know, public school teachers have been much maligned in places like Wisconsin and around the country, but we all know that they're really essential for the whole educational mission in reaching the next generation. And these teachers in particular are a fabulous group that is really dedicated and coming here after a long and hard day. They've been doing this all semester, and I just think they're just a fabulous group of teachers. I also want to thank Michael Nash of the Tenement Library for so generously hosting this session. For me, it's especially joyful to have our history teaching project's last event of the semester focus on Jesse Lemish's critique of the American historical profession, since Jesse himself is a gifted teacher. His innovative pedagogy and pioneering scholarship on viewing the American Revolution from the bottom up influenced both my own historical work and generations of historians who have been fortunate enough to learn from Jesse both in the classroom and through such path-breaking articles as Jack Tar in the Streets, Merchant Seamen and the Politics of Revolutionary America. My thanks to our distinguished panel of historians for making this session possible, and to Jesse for his generous support and advice in putting this panel together, and also for all he has done as both a historian and an activist to work for a more humane, democratic, and nonviolent world. I'm also want to say especially grateful to Staughton Lynd for coming up to New York for this session. His scholarship and lifetime of civil rights, peace, and labor activism has been an inspiration, and I'm really glad that Staughton is here, along with the rest of our panelists. The holding of this panel on historians, power, and politics is long overdue and highly relevant to the world in which historians work today. It's long overdue because the work of radical history that this session focuses on, Jesse Lemish's Present-Mindedness Revisited, Anti-Radicalism as a Goal of American Historical Writing Since World War II, which he delivered at the American Historical Association in 1969, is a classic in the history of dissent, but a neglected one. It has never been published in the United States. Indeed, Jesse tells me that back in the 60s, the paper was in the pre-internet era of those days, initially circulated via third and fourth generation Xeroxes. It did not even appear in print until 1975 and even then was brought out only by an obscure underground press in Canada, New Hogtown Press, and was poorly distributed. So today, while students studying the 1960s may know of such dramatic dissident oratory as Mario Savio's Bodies on the Gears speech, which I and others have studied, few are aware that university faculty organized against the Vietnam War, and that their opposition to that war gave rise to radical scholarship and oratory, such as Lemish's, that was every bit as eloquent and iconoclastic as their activist students. We know plenty about activism in the 60s, but far too little about how radical scholars challenged the conventional thinking of the time and challenged the organization of knowledge in the university. Lemisch in the 60s was both an activist and a scholar, and stood within the movement for the dignity and importance of scholarship. Radicalism in the various disciplines is an important part of the 1960s that has been largely lost in memory and should be retrieved in order to give us a fuller picture of what the 1960s were all about. Lemisch, as part of the group of radical historians, was seeking to get the American Historical Association to come out against the war in Vietnam in 1969, a move that mainstream historians resisted and ultimately defeated on the grounds that historians as professionals were and ought to remain politically neutral. So their professional organizations ought not to take a stance on the war. Present-Minded Revisited, Jesse's paper, was a searching critique that refuted these claims of political neutrality by exposing the Cold War and anti-radical politics embedded in much of mainstream historical writing at that time. The paper also reflected Lemisch's own encounters with political repression at the University of Chicago, where he had been fired because of his role in the anti-war movement there. Lemisch ended his paper with a dramatic call to resist unjust authority and to pursue the truth no matter how politically unpopular. His defiant words embody the questioning spirit of the 1960s, as well as any of the most stirring dissident oratory of that decade. Lemisch wrote, "You cannot lecture us on civility while you legitimize barbarity. You cannot fire us for activism without having your own activism exposed. You cannot call apologetics excellence without expecting the most rigorous and aggressive of scholarly replies. Fire us, expel us, jail us. We will not go away. We were at the steps of the Pentagon, and we are in the libraries, writing history, trying to cure it of your partisan and self-congratulatory fictions, trying to come a little closer to finding out how things really were." As to the ongoing relevance of Lemisch's critical history of American historians in that period, Noam Chomsky of MIT wrote me just today, "Jesse Lemisch's penetrating critique of anti-radical bias in the historical profession is regrettably as pertinent today as it was when Jesse issued this call for integrity and intellectual independence years ago. It poses starkly the challenges that should be faced with the courage and commitment that he has shown in his remarkable work." Whether one agrees or not with Lemisch's 1969 AHA paper, it raised important questions about the relationship between historians, power, and politics that merit a fair hearing. But such a hearing was denied to Lemisch when readers for the AHA's major historical journal, the American Historical Review, refused to publish the article on the grounds that were clearly political. The same thing happened in the other leading national journal of American historians, the Journal of American History. The anonymous readers' report for that journal were blatantly anti-radical, making it clear that the reader's political bias, not the quality of Lemisch's scholarship, had led to the refusal to publish his critique of the historical profession. Indeed, one of the journal readers used his report on Jesse's submission to indict not only Lemisch's paper, but radical historians more generally, implying that both had displayed a form of savagery in their writing and activism. And I quote, "I don't know how you can tell him that he simply cannot do this. And he certainly cannot do it in the pages of the Journal of American History. He probably believes that he can, which says something about how far he and his ilk are estranged from civilization." In other words, the gatekeepers for the two major journals of the American historical profession in the 60s chose to shut out Lemisch's paper, and by doing so, short-circuited an important dialogue about historians, politics, and power, about historians and war, a dialogue that a more politically healthy and open-minded profession would have welcomed and encouraged. The result is that published discussion of Lemish's paper has been largely confined to a few paragraphs in specialized studies of American historical writing, that is what we call historiography, such as Peter Novick's That Noble Dream and Peter Hoffer's Past Imperfect, and that Lemish's out-of-print work remains an underground classic, but one that has simply not been read by many historians or the public in our own era. It is time to bring Lemish's important critique of the American historical profession into print here in the United States and into the spotlight, so that we can promote the kind of dialogue about historians and politics that was repressed in the 60s, and in so doing, assess its relevance today for historians working in the United States at a time of what seems like perpetual war. My hope is that this panel will be a first step in the process of rediscovering and learning from this important piece of radical history. And I just want to add that I was a student of Jesse's back in the 1970s as an undergraduate at SUNY Buffalo. My senior thesis was done with Jesse as the supervisor of that work. And my finding in that study contradicted some of Jesse's indictment of liberals in Cold War America. I found an academic freedom case in University of Buffalo that liberals at the grassroots level were more willing to stand up to McCarthyism than more the nationally prominent liberals that Jesse studied and critiqued in Present-Minded Revisited in such convincing fashion. Rather than be upset by my dissident findings, and I always seem to have dissident findings, Jesse welcomed them as a valuable modification of his indictment, that the view of liberalism from the bottom up was surprisingly different from how it looked from Washington and New York. This gives you a sense of Jesse's open-mindedness and his encouragement of his students and younger scholars more generally. With Jesse, it was always follow the evidence, and that's what I think many of us have tried to do and often got into trouble for doing. Anyway, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the chair of our panel, the eminent historian and biographer, Blanche Cook. Blanche is a distinguished professor at John Jay College, is the author of many important works, including The Declassified Eisenhower, Crystal Eastman on Women and Revolution, and most recently, her definitive biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, which I can tell you that as an Eleanor Roosevelt scholar, that book is used on an almost daily basis by people who are seriously researching the 30s and Eleanor. And soon to culminate in a final, third and final volume that promises to be as magnificent as the first two best-selling volumes. So please join me in welcoming Blanche Cook.
I'm so moved to be here with Robbie's group and Robbie's teachers and some of our heroes that are in this room. My own hero, David McReynolds, is in this room, and lawyers and folks. That was such a splendid introduction. There's not a whole lot more I need to say, except I want to say two things. One, we really changed the world. We really changed the world. And PBS is going to broadcast the new Arsenault film on Freedom Riders. This is the 50th anniversary week of the first Freedom Riders. And I went to Hunter, where I had a Southern, the chair of the history department was named Mary Latimer Gambrell. And to give you a sense of how far we've come, when students would say, well, I feel, she would bang her fist on the desk and say, think, don't feel. Isn't that stupid? Anyway, we overcame that and tell our students we have to think and feel. And some of us at the City University, this is the 50th anniversary year of the City University, went south for freedom. We took 2 buses from Hunter, and I was student government president at the time, and I was suspended for misappropriating student funds. And as Mariletta McGambrell said, you broke the law. Anyway, so we have broken the law, and we continue to break the law. And I just want to say, and we're going to keep doing it, aren't we? I do want to come back and have a few minutes to talk about Bradley Manning and WikiLeaks and the fact that Bradley Manning has been in solitary, which is really torture, since June. And I think every historian and teacher who cares about freedom of information should care about Bradley Manning and get him out of, certainly, I think he's out of solitary as of yesterday, but get him out of prison. The declassified Eisenhower was reclassified under Reagan, so the only place you can read my documents in that book, The Overthrow of Dr. Mossadegh in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954, is in my book, so I think of it as a WikiLeaks book. So this is something we all care about. Then I want to say just a word. Do I have 15 minutes? I just want to say a word about how far we've come. Because when I couldn't find Jesse's book, which I have, I started looking for contemporary books, A Prophetic Minority, which is what we were, by Jack Newfield and lots of other people, and this wonderful book, Dissent, Explorations in the History of American Radicalism, in which Staughton Lynd and Jesse Lemisch are right next to each other. But to give you an example of how far we've come, there's not one article in this book by a woman. And the article on feminism is by a man. So you can see that we have made some progress, and I just want to say that the progress is, the fights for that progress are ongoing. There really was a book that was the textbook for all of us in graduate school in the 1960s, Henry Steele Commager and Samuel Eliot Morrison, and the chapter on slavery was Sambo and Sally, how happy they were. Do you believe that? It really is unbelievable, but that was our textbook. Let me say that women, and I want to just say a word about Naomi Weisstein, who in 1963 was first in her class at Harvard with a PhD in psychology, and the folks at Harvard said to her, how can a little girl like you teach a class, a great big class of men? And that really was the attitude. That was the attitude in SNCC, in SDS, and just across the board. And all of us have more or less experienced such things. And it is ongoing. I was vice president for research of the American Historical Association when there were all of these Holocaust deniers publishing, you know, the great lies about how nothing of this ever really happened. And the president of the AHA at the time, somebody you all know, and he's known as a liberal, do I dare name his name? Yes. Bill Luchtenberg said, well, we can't take a stand on this because we will politicize the profession. This is in the 1980s, okay? We will put, and we fought and we argued, and in the end, he left the room when the vote happened, and so the vote looked like it was unanimous because he was gone. But he said, if we take a stand on this and politicize the profession, why, we might have to take a stand on slavery and say slavery really happened. And we all said, well, yes, we just might, mightn't we? And now when they're trying to repeal the 20th century, here we are. And I think for those of us who are who deal with the 20th century, I mean, I'm really big into putches. We've had a putsch. Citizens United is a putsch. It says for the future, we're not going to have elections, we're going to have auctions. And we have to fight that. And we have to fight the insanity that is going on step by step, you know, issue by issue. And the good news is we will, because we're activists and scholars, and history is on our side. And so shoulder to shoulder, with women in leadership, we will move forward. And so now it is my great pleasure to introduce Jessie Lemisch, who has a BA from Yale, 1957, an MA from Columbia, a PhD from Yale. You were really working fast, 1963. I mean, it took me 10 years to do Eisenhower, and when I finished, I wrote in my journal, I've now spent most of my vital youth with one dead general. And I am going to finish Eleanor Roosevelt, Volume 3, this year. I only have 3 chapters left, and they're mostly written, but it's been 30 years, unlike Jessie, who gets things out very, very quickly. And I have to say, Jessie, fired from the University of Chicago, Northwestern, held on to other jobs at Roosevelt and SUNY Buffalo, but the best part is we hired him at John Jay. And I think those were really great years for Jessie and for John Jay. You know his great work on history from the bottom up, the American Revolution, Jack Tar in the Streets. He's been working recently on New York City to Disabled, Take a Hike, which is on nation.com, and professors as welfare queens. What is up with this war on teachers? And Ellen Schrecker is here, so we can impose on her and David McReynolds is here. We can impose on him for some thoughts about this. Jessie's work has been published in the William and Mary Quarterly, in the Journal of American History, in The Nation, the New York Times Book Review, New Politics, and despite the fact that your radical work wasn't in, all of your work is radical, so some work was published in the American Historical Review. Isn't that true? And the Harvard Law Review, and of course the Radical History Review, which was based at John Jay. And it gives me the greatest pleasure to introduce to you our hero, who has guided us in so many ways, Jessie Lemisch.
Is this thing on?
Yes.
Okay. Out of a combination of democracy and disability, I'd like to stay where I am rather than go up there. Am I visible? Am I audible? Yes. Okay? All right. Okay. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to Robbie for pulling this wonderful event together. As he says, he was a student of mine at Buffalo and has far surpassed me with magnificent work, in particular his fantastic biography of Mario Savio. And thanks also to Mike Nash of Tamament for giving us this wonderful roof over our heads. I'm reminded when I'm here that someplace around here are the tapes of my mother's interviews that she did for the Oral History of the American Left out of Tamament, putting together a radio series called Grandma Was an Activist. Thanks, of course, to all of you for coming, and my enormous gratitude to my fellow panelists. Blanche, remember to call time if I run over.
Okay.
In the early British New Left, in the early 60s, there was a story of a sociological study that went comically awry. It was a study of one industrial plant seen through the lens of the then dominant notion of the end of ideology. In accord with those mistaken ideas, the study purported to show that workers in the plant were quiescent and content, happy workers, as Harvey Swados would call them in his debunking of the idea. The British study presented the workers as passive, accepting, and lacking in consciousness. However, just as the journal was being published, the workers rose up, seized the plant, and from its roof they ran up the red flag. All this was a complete surprise to the academic sociologists. How could the sociologists have been caught with their pants down in this way? What was missing in the end of ideology worldview was what Edward Thompson called human agency. It's also missing, I would argue, in Obama's famous pragmatism. As I'll show, Obama's "the perfect is the enemy of the good" is a precise updating of the end of ideology. No wonder he's been constantly caught off guard by the Arab Spring. From academics to presidents, many are surprised when popular movements from the bottom up, longing for a better world, shake what those above them take to be permanent reality, unalterable givens. Let's hope for many more popular interventions to get us out of the barbaric morass we're in. The story of the British plant has been repeated on a larger scale in the surprise the uprising in Egypt gave to specialists in Middle Eastern studies. An account in the Chronicle of Higher Education adds it up. We were blindsided. The political scientists had focused on presidents and kings and saw only stability, the supposed robustness and durability of authoritarian regimes, permanence. The academics had no notion of agency. I think this is a general problem, and it links the historiography of the 2010s to that of the 1950s, against which I rebelled in turning to history from the bottom up. History from the top down blinds itself to reality by counting out interventions from below. Today, as in the period I wrote about, liberal analysis and commentary ignore the forces outside of that limited and exclusive body that Sir Lewis Namier and others have called the political nation. In fact, what moves our politics is the intrusion of reality now and then into our otherwise sterile and stupid two-party politics. Analysis after analysis by liberals focus on such trivia as the supposedly admirable craftiness of the president, whether Governor Chris Christie will run for vice president, Nancy Pelosi as exponent of, quote, the core ideas of liberalism, and so on. This kind of stuff sanctifies, presents as really important and legitimizes the trivialities of our vapid and conservative politics. Consider the supposed healthcare debate in which an enormous giveaway to the private insurers was described as the limit of the possible simply by labeling Medicare for all off the table, with legions of liberal commentators agreeing, and of course nobody dared mention truly socialized medicine. Really, this stuff is right out of Daniel Bell, who wrote in, you guessed it, Encounter back in 1956, quote, democratic politics means bargaining among legitimate groups and the search for consensus. Democratic politics means bargaining among legitimate groups and the search for consensus. A whole generation of scholars were blind to the exclusions in this definition, legitimate groups. This is another sense in which on active service, this is Present-Mindedness Revisited as published in Canada, this is another sense in which on active service is directly relevant today. Really, it is just plain frightening to see how close the dominant ideas today are to those I criticized in this book. Whatever its faults, and certainly it did have its faults, I think that on active service points us in useful directions which have yet to be adequately followed up. I hope to see more work on the politics of scholarship the connections between historiography and the historian's politics. Today, I want to give a very preliminary and sketchy suggestion of what an updating of this book might look like. Unaccustomed as I am to quoting Marx, no paper by a leftist would be complete, thank you, Staughton, without such a quotation. So let me say at this point that what's coming back in historiography is what Marx called die alte Scheiß. Thank you, Tom. The old shit. Here, within our time limits, are eight, that is an exact quote from Marx. That's my quote from Marx. Here, within our time limits, are 8 such items. Case study 1, Alan Brinkley, Liberalism and Collapse, the Liberal as Union Buster. Columbia historian Alan Brinkley is a liberal and pro-union. In 2004, he told the Columbia campus newspaper, "I'm a great supporter of unionization. I think that the decline of unions is one of the great catastrophes of our recent economic life." But on his own campus, he is a union buster. When Columbia's Graduate Student Employees United struck in 2005, Brinkley, who was then provost, circulated among administrators a plan to hire scabs, take away strikers' stipends, and blacklist them for future employment. Here at NYU, that man just 2 floors above us, President Sexton, has taken an equally abysmal position in regard to GSOC, the NYU TA union, which I support, as I do Columbia GSEU and GSO at Yale. Case study 2, Biographies of Great White Men. Brinkley is also the author of Henry Luce and His American Century. Dwight MacDonald's biographer, Michael Resin, has seen in this an apologetic streak, an attempt to portray a successful huckster as an intellectual publisher. What, Resin asks, is one to make of this record of dubious opinions held by an allegedly powerful intellect? Brinkley's book is part of a massive wave of biographies of those I've called great white men, conveying the impression that these are the people who make history and that it is their characters that determine where things go. This historiographical wave often explicitly seeks to take back the gains of the 60s, which gave us a deeper understanding of the participation of ordinary people in the making of history. This wave resonates with my point in On Active Service about Alan Nevins's increasingly friendly 2 editions of his biography of John D. Rockefeller, first in 1940 and then rewritten more positively in 1953, like a Soviet encyclopedia, and Nevins's 1954 call for a rewriting of American history in ways more sympathetic to those who he called the architects of our material growth. T.J. Stiles, more recently, biographer of Cornelius Vanderbilt, all but repeats Nevins when he sees in recent decades, quote, a sweeping reassessment of the so-called robber barons. Case study 3, Founders Chic. The trend towards triumphalist biographies of the mighty is most noticeable in regard to the early period of U.S. history. Jill Lepore says, quote, the nation's bookshelves sag with doorstop biographies of the founders. In David Waldstrecker's term, this is founders chic. Discussing in particular Joseph Ellis's founding brothers, Joanne Friedman's Affairs of Honor, and David McCullough's John Adams, Waldstrecker notes the feeling among various writers that the social history that is a heritage of the 60s had unfortunately shifted history's focus from great leaders to those described as the marginalized and downtrodden. Washington biographer John Ferling frets, where once the likes of Benjamin Franklin and James Madison received considerable attention in the pages of scholarly journals, today's reader is more likely to read about the plight of urban chimney sweeps or unwed mothers. How sad. What this PC bashing adds up to is a condemnation of history from the bottom up and a rejoicing in the comeback of a history focusing on elite politics. And with attention returned to the great, Walt Strecker sees a reduction of history to personality. Character is king. Continuing on Founders Chic, here's an episode that I've called Gordon Wood Jumps the Shark. One can almost hear the Star-Spangled Banner in the background of Wood's 2010 New York Review of Books tirade against the same John Ferling, who did dare to offer a critique of George Washington. Wood says, Ferling can't easily explain why the Washington whose character he has tried to denigrate so excessively was honored and extolled by his countrymen. Heavenly chords here. Honored and extolled by his countrymen precisely because he tried so often to behave in a disinterested manner and always sought to lead his nation as wisely as he could. He legitimately earned the admiration and respect of his countrymen. Calling Parson Weems, it's back to the 50s. Speaking of Wood, we know that the New York Times Book Review is a terribly shallow place, particularly under Sam Tannenhouse, the biographer of Whittaker Chambers and William F. Buckley. But I haven't heard the same kind of comments about the New York Review of Books, which also deserves such comments. Supposedly founded as a kind of highfalutin antidote to the Times Book Review, it's almost unbelievable that a publication pretending to intellectual depth should be so out of touch with reality as to have had as its major reviewers in American history Van Woodward, Ed Morgan, and Gordon Wood. How boringly mainstream. Shame on you, New York Review. In 2003, Franklin biographer H.W. Brands wrote in The Atlantic, also under the title Founders Chic, regretting the neglect of the Founding Fathers in the 60s and 70s, and grieving over that period's shift of attention to blacks, women, and ordinary people. Abigail Adams, he worried, was more familiar to school children than her husband, and George Washington Carver more familiar than George Washington. Really? Happily, says Brand, that's over. Now they're back. And he expressly connects this return to the founders to larger political developments today. Quote from Brands, "The founders' revival is in part a reflection of the anti-liberal reaction that begins with Ronald Reagan and continues today." Case study 4, Gilder, Lehrman, and the Manhattan Institute tilt American history to the right. Richard Gilder and Lou Lehrman are both rich Yaleys from the class of 1960. Gilder is founder and former chair of the right-wing think tank, the Manhattan Institute. His anger against unions and demonstrations led to the semi-privatization of Central Park under the Central Park Conservancy, which cooperated with Giuliani in 2004 in keeping demonstrations out of this formerly public space. In history, we've seen a Manhattan Institute takeover of the New York Historical Society by the Gilder Lehrman Institute. One fruit of this was the 2004 exhibit on Alexander Hamilton entitled "The Man Who Made Modern America," an exhibit which led the viewer inexorably to the re-election of George Bush, the rejection of the last 35 years of social history, and a paean to triumphalist capitalism. The curator was Richard Brookhiser, yet another biographer of Hamilton and Washington, and senior editor of the National Review. The central themes of the exhibit announced themselves fairly garishly even before you entered. A huge multicolored banner stretching a full block along Central Park West reproduced the $10 bill. Get it? Take a look in your wallet. This huge $10 bill left a tiny space for entry into the building, and the banner otherwise covered the entire 4-story facade of NYHS. Gilder and Lehrman spent millions on this high-tech exhibit. Overall, the New York Times reported, the exhibit cost the Society $5 million. The Times article quotes historian Mike Wallace as fearing that the Historical Society could, quote, wind up as a subsidiary of the Gilder-Lehrman Institute. As we enter the main hall, we see, straight out of 1984, several gigantic video screens showing modern scenes which are presented as Hamilton's legacy: the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, commuters at Grand Central, high-rises under construction, and, no kidding, paratroopers jumping out of airplanes. Though there may be something to presenting these things as a Hamiltonian heritage, the exhibit leaves no doubt as to the heroic quality of that heritage. G&L's takeover and purge of the New York Historical Society is part of their larger penetration of American history, a little reminiscent to me of the CIA's support for the Congress for Cultural Freedom, including the funding of Encounter. Gilder and Lehrman are buying legitimacy by buying historians, giving money to Yale and to the Organization of American Historians, constructing a board with some stellar left liberal types on it. This offers a clear picture of the use of history for present-minded ideological purposes. But the New York Historical Society exhibit had neither subtlety nor historiographical sophistication. The codpiece slipped, and the right-wing agenda came right out in your face, starting with that huge $10 bill hanging there over Central Park West. Case Study 5, 60s Revisionism. When I wrote on active service, the 60s were just beginning to work their way into the textbooks, complete with Bill Luchtenberg's preposterous notion that the anti-Vietnam War movement began in the U.S. Senate. I don't know what the texts are saying now, and I hope somebody will be looking into this. It's important. I thought of this recently when I saw an Inside Higher Education article by Richard Oman positing the 60s as a golden age of academic freedom, which certainly ignores the experience of at least two of us on this panel. If you think this is old news, this talk of academic freedom violations, no longer relevant today, then I say, think about Juan Cole's non-appointment at Yale. Think about Norman Finkelstein's almost Staughton-esque academic non-career. Let me suggest that dissenting views on Palestine and Israel is the communism of today, the impermissible dissent, a better measure of the state of academic freedom in America now. And note today's news where the CUNY board has vetoed John Jay's nomination of Tony Kushner for an honorary degree because they don't like his views on Israel. This is a big thing in academics. Case Study 6, Foreign Relations. I have little expertise here, but here are two suggestive episodes. The American Historical Association declares neutrality on Armenian genocide. In 2005, to its credit, the AHA protested the Turkish government's role in cancellation of a conference on Ottoman Armenians. But I found it jarring that in the midst of this otherwise commendable expression, AHA President James Sheehan of Stanford felt the need to say, quote, "Needless to say, the association does not have a position on the fate of the Armenians." I protested. In a letter to the AHA's magazine Perspectives, I wrote, "As a veteran of Vietnam-era struggles within the professional associations, I know just how militantly the AHA has held to the notion that, in Jim Sheehan's words, it does not take a position on particular historical issues. But as President Sheehan reminded us, the Turkish government has denied that a genocide took place. Can it be that the AHA has no position on the fact of the Armenian genocide? In response to my query on what I take to be a related question, the AHA's executive director reminded me of the AHA Council's 1991 statement deploring Holocaust denial, quote, "No serious historian questions that the Holocaust took place." I'm sure some readers will see an inconsistency between the AHA's position on the Holocaust and its position on the Armenian genocide, as do I. I'm sure others will find enough angels on the head of this pin to squirm out of it. But doesn't it come down to this? The AHA deplores Holocaust denial in one case, but is agnostic in another. It's politics. Case study 6B, excuse my numbering. Guatemala syphilis studies. One hand reveals, the other conceals. Liberal historian Susan Reverby's suppression of photographic evidence associated with U.S. atrocities in Guatemala on grounds they would be misinterpreted and thus harm U.S. foreign policy. Reverby has revealed the horrors committed by the U.S. Public Health Service in Guatemala in the 1940s when PHS injected unknowing people with syphilis. But in revealing this, she also concealed some of the story in ways that seemed to violate standard historical practice and the obligation to reveal sources. In explaining this lapse, she makes it clear that she lets her politics, in particular in regard to American foreign policy, overrule her history. The winter 2011 issue of Wellesley magazine has an article about this by Louisa Kasdan called "A Dark Study Comes to Light." The article recounts an episode that was recently publicized through various media, and I suspect you've heard of it. Reverby was, before this, best known for her two books on the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. The books dealt with the U.S. Public Health Service's study, which observed but did not treat 437 African American men with syphilis, 1942 to 72. In 2010, she followed this up with research that became an article on Guatemala, 1946 to 48. In this article, Reverby shows that PHS went beyond the merely observational studies that had been done at Tuskegee, horrible enough in themselves, went beyond that to deliberately infect with syphilis 427 Guatemalans, and they concealed what they were doing. Reverby has been justly celebrated for this expose, but towards the end of the article, I was surprised to come across indication that she had not only revealed, but also in some sense concealed. The suppression concerns photographs. For the record, the PHS had photographed hundreds of patients and their inoculations. Reverby made many copies, apparently with the permission of the archive. Kasdan, in her article about this in the Wellesley magazine, describes the media frenzy that followed upon Reverby's revelation of the Guatemala atrocities. Media wanted, and this is quoting from Kasdan's article, media wanted access to the photos of the subjects in the study. When Al Jazeera and the Iranian state press agency called, Reverby made a quick judgment call. She would not release the photos. For a long-time board member of the American Civil Liberties Union, it was a tough but instinctive reaction. That's Kasdan's paraphrase, and Kasdan quotes Reverby as saying, "All I could think of was Abu Ghraib and the damage that would come from another series of photos with white U.S. hands on dark bodies." Think about that. Set up to admire Reverby for her revelations, I was floored by this. Why had she withheld the pictures, and what was her rationale? really, to protect U.S. foreign policy. But courtesy dictated that I first establish whether Kasdan had gotten what Reverby said right. Since Reverby happens to be a Facebook friend, I've respected her work in the past, I began what would turn out to be, because of her evasions, an extended and repetitious series of the same queries over and over again. When she finally did respond, she offered nothing at odds with the account that had been given in Wellesley magazine. Had she offered patient confidentiality as a reason for withholding the photos, I would have understood that, while nonetheless wondering whether such confidentiality does last 65 years. But she did not invoke confidentiality. Instead, she wrote to me, quote, "I have spent a long time watching the way the photos from Tuskegee have been misused. I didn't want to see the Guatemala photos misused worldwide. And it was becoming obvious quickly that this would happen. Frankly, I didn't think it was my place to make foreign policy by releasing them. Instead, it seems to me she decided to support U.S. foreign policy by not releasing the photos. Think about these issues. Would it have been better for the world not to have the photos of Abu Ghraib, to which she compares these photos? The reader can judge whether this suppression of the photos fits with what we think of as the role of the historian involving the discovery of what really happened. Reverby's position seems to me a direct descendant of Conyers Reed's 1949 AHA presidential address, which I quoted in On Active Service. Let me just select a couple of lines from that. This is unbelievable, but it's true. This is what Reed said. "Discipline is the essential prerequisite of every effective army, whether it march under the stars and stripes or under the hammer and sickle. Total war enlists everyone and calls upon everyone to assume his part. The historian is no freer from this obligation than the physicist. This sounds like the advocacy of one form of social control as against another. In short, it is." That's his own comment. What, Reed asked, should the historian do with data that he or she uncovers that undermines a benign picture of U.S. history? The quote from Reed goes on, "We shall still, like the doctor, have to examine social pathology, if only to diagnose the nature of the disease. But we must realize that not everything which takes place in the laboratory is appropriate for broadcasting at the street corners." Reed's open call for suppression seems to me to resonate very directly with Reverby. Do we really want historians to join the crowds in the street crying out belligerently and pugnaciously, "USA, USA, USA"? Or let them join the crowds, let them shout that, but should that lead them to suppress important historical sources?
Wrap it up.
In conclusion, briefly, what do we make of all this? To see past, present, and future more clearly, we need new movements. We need to put behind us all the old shice, all the old stuff about politics is the art of the possible. We need in our politics and in our history to move outside that limited grouping called the political nation, beyond the notion that democracy means bargaining only among legitimate groups. I say, hooray for the illegitimate. To change the world and to clear our minds and to make a truer history, we need 2-3 many Arab Springs, 2-3 many Wisconsins, and radical scholarship. Let's do it.
Let's do it. So we have our marching orders. Let's do it. But before we go out to do it, I am so pleased to introduce Staughton Lynd, who taught history at Spelman and Yale in the 1960s. And I was just at Spelman, where the legacy of Howard Zinn and Staughton Lynd still exists. The young black women of Spelman, the oldest historically black college, were talking about Alice Walker, their student, and the legacy at Spelman. Audre Lorde's papers are there, and a great movement. The oldest black college in the for women in the United States has a GLBTQ group. Is that amazing? I mean, that is amazing. And so from Spelman and Yale, Staughton Lynd coordinated the hugely successful Freedom Schools for the Mississippi Summer Project of 1964. After moving to New Haven, he became a leading spokesman for opponents of the Vietnam War, and he was blacklisted after that as a university professor, and therefore he and his wife became attorneys. Since 1976, they have lived in Youngstown, Ohio, worked with and represented local victims of deindustrialization, prisoners confined to Ohio's first supermax security prison, and every one of these PICs, the prison industrial complex supermaxes, are real torture centers, which we need to talk about, and I assume at some point we will. His classic study, Class, Conflict, Slavery, and the U.S. Constitution, has recently been reprinted by the Cambridge University Press, as has his Intellectual Origins of American Radicalism. He has written many other works on labor and political history, and some of his most influential essays have recently been published in the Staughton Lynd Reader. I don't know if the Staughton Lynd Reader is here, but I recommend it. Just go out and get it. Thank you so much. Staughton Lynd.
Jesse and I have a persistent need to have something to argue about. So let me begin by describing our most recent serious difference of opinion. At an earlier point in this process, I must have said something to the effect that Jesse's paper at the 1969 gathering of the American Historical Association was courageous. And Jesse responded, in effect, not really. I've given the matter some thought and have decided that I'm right and Jesse's wrong. Blacklisting is something more than being rejected for appointment or promotion by one or two history faculties. It is all-encompassing. It is characterological. It is the definitive determination by one's more powerful peers that you, whoever that is at the moment, are not one of us. The paradigmatic example is Herbert Aptheker. After he wrote and published his important dissertation on American Negro slave revolts, he never held more than a part-time teaching position anywhere. Toward the end of both their careers, C. Van Woodward led a ridiculous campaign to prevent Aptheker from conducting a single not-for-credit seminar at a Yale college on W.E.B. Du Bois, who had made Herbert his literary executor. For Jesse to blast establishment historians at the premier slave market of the profession, or as in his famous boom, boom, boom speech at the Organization of American Historians, to target Bernard Bailyn by name was to act with great courage. He may have survived as an academic, but he had no way of knowing that would be the case in 1969 when he said, as Robbie has already quoted, "Fire us, expel us, jail us, we will not go away." He has shown equal fortitude in dealing with Naomi's catastrophic medical challenges. There is no rational way for him to avoid our accolades, and that is why I am here. 36 years after its appearance, I have no criticisms of this splendid little book.
Amazing.
I propose to use my remaining time in exploring the academic ideology that Jesse asks us to consider. When my son Lee, now 53, was little, we had an annual ritual of doing something together on his birthday, May 9th. 1964-65 was my first year as a junior professor at Yale. In May 1965, Lee and I drove from New Haven to Mount Tom in southern Massachusetts and made the modest ascent to its summit, where we spent the night. After Lee was asleep, I read by flashlight a paperback book about the Bay of Pigs invasion. I learned that a Yale professor named Richard Bissell, on leave to the CIA, had been in charge. I was shocked. When I had first been offered a job at Yale in 1962, the historian who showed me around told me not to leave my briefcase in the car at lunchtime because we were in Darktown, and not to buy a home in a certain suburb because the sons of Abraham were numerous there. I rejected the job offer. I felt that I might be in the academic cactus league, but I had not sunk that low. And besides, I was teaching in a hub of the Southern Civil Rights Movement with Howard Zinn as a colleague and Alice Walker as one of my students. 2 years later, Howard had been brutally fired by Spelman College. Alice had transferred to Sarah Lawrence. Black Power was in the ascendant, and the Lynds' 2 children had formed a united front with the platform "No Further South." Yale again offered me a job. I clenched my teeth and determined to find a way to live with the stereotypes about blacks and Jews that George Pearson had articulated when Yale first courted me. Somehow, though, I had not expected to learn that one of my academic confreres was actually managing the counter-revolution. We're talking about more than what appears in books and presidential addresses at the AHA, and about more than foreign policy. At the end of Freedom Summer, I drove the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party candidates for Congress, Annie Devine, Victoria Gray, and Fannie Lou Hamer, from Mississippi to New York for a mass meeting at Carnegie Hall prior to the Atlantic City convention of the National Democratic Party. C. Van Woodward invited Alice and myself to have tea with him after the meeting. But not long after, as Van and I walked across the Yale campus, he asked me, "Staughton, what are we going to do about the communists in SNCC?" "What communists?" I responded, and answer came there none. Later, when my personal weather forecast at the Yale History Department turned from spring sunshine to heavy frost, I took Van to lunch and asked him what was going on. He solemnly assured me that no names were mentioned. indeed perhaps the two most historians of the Americas in our time. C. Van Woodward and Ed Morgan joined their colleague John Morton Blum in publicly pretending that the reason for denying me tenure was financial. Of course, Harvard was no different. When I was an undergraduate there, I took a course on colonial history from Samuel Eliot Morison. Morison regarded Christopher Columbus not as a genocidal imperialist, but as a fellow mariner. I have a visual memory of him lecturing in his yachting whites. Later, as Jesse wrote in On Active Service, Arthur J. Schlesinger Jr. learned about the Bay of Pigs invasion in advance. But the timeless, selfless search for truth led him to conceal that information from the public. And the mindset at issue is not a merely Ivy League phenomenon. When I was very young, I read a proletarian novel by Alexander Saxton entitled Grand Crossing. One day at a Harvard sherry sipping, the protagonist decides to embed himself in the working class by a decisive act of will, going to Chicago. Well, Jesse and I tried it. Jesse and I had the door to academe slammed in our faces by the University of Chicago. I can also report negative research findings concerning Chicago State College, Northern Illinois University, University of Illinois Circle Campus, Roosevelt University, Loyola University, and Northwestern. In fairness, except that Chicago and Northwestern, the malefactors were not historians, but administrators, who, after the history department offered me a job, vetoed my appointment. But we are talking about a mindset that, whether expressed by scholars or by bureaucrats, pervaded and pervades American university. What are the elements of that mindset? First, whether as historians or CIA operatives, these folks believe that freedom is unimaginable except on the foundation of capitalism. Hence, the immediate task is always overthrowing the opponents of capitalism. In Iran and Guatemala in 1954, in Cuba in the 1960s, in Chile in 1973, in Nicaragua in the 1980s, and throughout all those years in the Soviet Union. Somehow our designated enemies tend to be statesmen who have nationalized oil or natural gas. Most recently, Saddam Hussein, Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, and Colonel Gaddafi. Second, we must not regard establishment academics who moonlight in Washington as motivated by personal wealth or position. They are the fixers for American capitalism, the individuals trained to manage the system as a whole and keep it from harm. I wrote an essay about such men in the state of New York during the American Revolution with the title, A Governing Class on the Defensive. Gouverneur Morris, for example, is sometimes said to have gallantly sacrificed his personal hostility to African American slavery in order to make the concessions necessary so that slavery could expand into the Southwest and the southern states could join the new nation. Gouverneur Morris is also the man who famously compared New York City artisans to rattlesnakes, who might come out to bask in the spring sunshine but could bite before noon. Morris also had something to say about Thomas Paine, who, when Maurras was appointed ambassador to France, was awaiting execution in a French prison. Maurras called Paine, quote, a mere adventurer without fortune, without family or connections, ignorant even of grammar, unquote, and did nothing to obtain his release. From Maurras to Theodore Roosevelt's description of Paine as a filthy little atheist, the pattern of ruling class condescension shines through. Finally, as former military officer and West Point professor Andrew Bacevich keeps telling us, those governing the United States share a misplaced confidence in the efficacy of violence. The so-called surgical assassination of Osama bin Laden will only deepen this presumption. We just learned, I think, that Osama bin Laden did not have a weapon, but that somehow his mannerisms indicated a likelihood of resistance to the heavily armed commandos who surrounded him, and so they shot him dead. But I think a clearer example is that just as President Reagan sought to kill Gaddafi and ended in murdering his infant daughter, members of NATO, including the United States, now pursue the same target under the pretense that Gaddafi lives in a command and control center and have apparently killed a son and 3 small grandchildren. Approach the mindset of our rulers from any direction, and one finds a readiness to believe that some form of war will solve impending problems. One recalls the generals who wanted to use nuclear weapons in Cuba, and how Walt Whitman Rostow, a contemporary of Dave Dellinger at Yale who had been named for Whitman, wanted to bomb the dikes at Haiphong. If I could have just a moment more. I believe we should return to the idea that our country is the world and our countrymen are all humankind. It was articulated by Tom Paine in The Rights of Man, by William Lloyd Garrison on the masthead of The Liberator, by Frederick Douglass when he returned from his first trip outside the United States, by Albert Parsons speaking to his jury before he was executed, by Eugene Debs in the writings and speeches during World War I that caused him to be incarcerated. Henry Thoreau found different words for the same idea in his speech on slavery in Massachusetts. After fugitive Anthony Burns was seized in broad daylight on the streets of Boston and returned to slavery. We should, Thoreau wrote, be men first and Americans at a late and convenient hour. Howard Zinn quoted these words toward the end of his exemplary transition from World War II bombardier to steadfast opponent of all bombing and all modern wars. As the little girl says in Carl Sandburg's The People Yes, sometime they'll give a war and nobody will come.
Thank you so much. I just want to announce that the Eisenhower Library just this week, you might be interested, opened and release something like 58 boxes of Richard B. Zell's papers, which have been classified until this week. So for those of us who like to look at newly opened CIA atrocities, that's going to be really very interesting, and the finding aid is on the Eisenhower Library. If there's anybody in the room that is interested. I am delighted, thank you so much, Staughton. I'm delighted to introduce Carolyn Rusti Eisenberg, who has a BA from the University of Chicago, a PhD from Columbia. She is president of...
I'm not president yet.
You're not president yet? A professor of U.S. foreign policy at Hofstra. I thought you were president.
No.
No. She's the author of a prize-winning book, Drawing the Line. I can't read your handwriting. American, what is it?
American Decision to Divide Germany.
The American Decision to Divide Germany. And she is now working on her new book, which is a new look at Nixon, Kissinger, and national security. She is co-chair of the Legislative Working Group for United for Peace and Justice, and are you still a member of the Peace History Society?
And of all good things, yes.
Okay.
Historians Against War.
Historians Against War.
I'm going to take this podium.
Good.
And you
I think
get-
short people should take podiums.
Napoleonic complexes. Yes. I just need to slant.
You want to stand on something?
That's enough. Okay. So I think I'm the historian on the panel who was actually a student of Jesse's at the University of Chicago. And like others today, I want to speak in a more personal way about some of that experience. A lot of the ideas that that we've been talking about today are not, I didn't really encounter those ideas in a book, in Jesse's book, but really in the classrooms and coffee shops and meeting rooms at the U of C. And then when I reread the book, I was struck by the cast of characters and how many of these characters had actually figured in my own working life. So in my remarks, I'd like to begin with some of the important things that I learned from Jesse when he was my college professor, and say a bit about the issue of political repression and how it affected my career as a historian of U.S. foreign policy. And we all have a lot to say, but if I manage to get to the end, a little bit about how these issues ramify in the present. So I came into Jesse's American Revolution class after a mystifying experience the previous quarter with his then colleague Daniel Boorstin. Because of an interest that I developed in high school, I enrolled in Boorstin's course on the Puritan New England. And during 10 weeks of immersion in the writings of Cotton Mather, John Winthrop, and Jonathan Edwards, I was frequently surprised by Boorstin's earnest refusal to see these people as rigid or ideological. And on those rare occasions when there was time for questions in class, I would express my own sense that abstract Calvinist principles were shaping the Puritans' response to what we then called the New World. And although Boorstin was actually quite unimpressed by my comments or questions, naive as a Chicago undergraduate, you know how arrogant and stupid we were. So I thought, well, he doesn't like my questions, but if I show that I've really mastered the text, and that I'm really looking very carefully at it, that when I came time to write my final, that he would be impressed. And actually he wasn't. And I received the lowest grade in his history course ever with the suggestion by him, because my father said you have to go talk to him, that I'd missed the point of the course entirely. And it wasn't until I arrived in Jesse's class that the light began to dawn because as he began to discuss the significance of consensus history and the Cold War views that underpinned it, that I began to appreciate for the first time that Daniel Boorstin's rigid insistence that the Puritans weren't rigid, that they were really pragmatists who never let theology interfere with their flexible response to the environment, that his feelings on this subject were not casual. That this was all about American exceptionalism, the end of ideology, the genius of our politics, where there are no fundamental conflicts and where competing interests could be adjusted in congenial fashion. So appearances to the contrary, the Puritans were our first anti-communists, laying the foundation for a class-stratified society without class conflict. And actually, Boorstin was right. I really had missed the point of his class entirely. And I deserved my grade. Oh my God. So what did I learn from Jesse? I learned that studying history was a process of interpretation in which ideas about the present inevitably shaped reflections on past events. If present-mindedness was an unavoidable component of historical inquiry, it also had to be identified and questioned. As a teacher, Jesse was not bent on persuading us of the correctness of one particular view, but of empowering students to develop their own critical skills in thinking about both past and present. There was one idea, however, on which he did insist, and that was that elitism had prevented a generation of historians from recognizing the role of ordinary people in shaping our country's history, and many people have talked about that today. 4 decades later, this seems commonplace, that we can't understand the past without looking beyond the role of great leaders. History from the bottom up, as he described it, is now a staple of our profession. But at the time when Jesse was teaching at Chicago, this was really a very novel idea. And as we collectively looked at the American Revolution, the kind of social history that Jesse and Staughton were promoting offered a source of new questions and richness of insight that made the whole enterprise come alive. Jesse's anti-elitism had one further consequence, which is sort of outside the bounds of today's discussion, but I'm just going beyond. And that was the democratic way in which he conducted his class. We all called him Jesse, a striking exception at the University of Chicago at that time. But more relevant was his rejection of the whole apparatus of academic authority and deference. If Daniel Boorstin, with his authoritarian air and refusal to countenance alternative ideas, represented one extreme, Jesse was on the other. Class discussions were truly collaborative affairs. He wasn't much interested in grades, tests, deadlines, page lengths, nor did he hesitate to say that he didn't know something. He didn't care if we critiqued his articles or Staughton's. Actually, I sometimes think he liked it when we critiqued Staughton's articles. He didn't even insist. It's true, you know. He didn't even insist on controlling the discussion. What he brought to the table was intellectual excitement, respect for students, and a palpable commitment to figuring out well-founded answers to historical questions. Of all the things that I learned from Jesse, this was the most important. As a teacher of history, it gave me a model of how to run a class without the trappings of authority. It allowed me to see that I could use my own knowledge, honest enthusiasm, and curiosity, plus genuine respect for the students in the class to make things work. Because of the oddities of my own career, which I'll be getting to, I have taught an incredible diversity of students, young and old, from welfare recipients in Newark, prison guards, future policymakers at the School of International Affairs at Columbia, New York City adult workers, lower middle class Republicans on Long Island. Whatever the setting, the Jesse model has stayed with me my whole life, and it has worked. Underneath this pedagogy is a democratic idea which after 40 years of teaching, I still believe, that in any group of people, there is a great, often untapped capacity to think seriously and creatively about human issues. With that as a background, I want to say a few words about the complexity of my own career and the ideas contained in the book. So that brings me to this topic, which is not going to go on forever, called the McNeil curse. Now, this is a story that's been told many times, and actually, I'm not sure if it's true, but some of it's true. In 1966, when Jesse's contract at the University of Chicago was not renewed, there was an outpouring of protest on the campus. One result, which from today's vantage point is nothing short of stunning, was that the chairman of the history department, William McNeill, agreed to a public debate about this decision. And with me. And I was 21 years old. I was on that panel. And I took it upon myself to explain to McNeill the path-breaking original nature of Jesse's research and teaching and why this should be of value to the institution. McNeill, sort of like Borston, wasn't so enthusiastic about my reflections. And he actually offered the opinion that given my shallow understanding of the historical enterprise, my own career in the field was likely to be doomed. I've always referred to this as McNeill's curse. It was my belief that he gave a little push in that direction by making sure that the University of Chicago offered me the littlest fellowship that I got from any other PhD program in the country. And when in my 30s I had very serious career difficulties, I used to joke that the bad luck originated from that wicked fairy godfather, William McNeill. So how does my experience relate to Jesse's book? One point of disagreement is that there was more variation in the behavior of mainstream historians than I think he acknowledges. I did my graduate work at Columbia, and during that time I was co-chair of the Graduate History Union and served on the Strike Steering Committee in 1968. None of these activities were a great secret, but the response of historians there was quite varied. William Leuchtenberg, who may end up as the villain of the whole seminar today, he was furious and would many years later play a very damaging role in my career. But Richard Hofstadter, who was my doctoral advisor, was really quite supportive despite disagreements on virtually everything. And when he died, near the time of my orals, Eric McKittrick stepped up to replace him. McKittrick, as some of you know, was to the right of Attila the Hun. But not only did he orchestrate several prestigious jobs for me when I left Columbia, but years later, when my career was almost in ruins, he came forward again and explained that as my doctoral advisor, he felt a lifelong obligation to help me, and he did. That said, I think there's a good deal of truth in Jesse's claims about the role of repression in the historical field. I know this runs against the conventional wisdom, which is that leftists dominate. But this was not always the case, assuming that it has some greater validity now. 30 years ago, a scholar like Barbara Weinstein could not have been elected president of the AHA, and if your name was Foner, this was not an asset. But the change was more gradual and less complete than is sometimes thought. A few famous cases, including Jesse's and Staughton's, received some, although frankly insufficient, attention. But many of the folks who were fired, nobody ever heard of, because they weren't Yale trained and they had never received recognition in the historical profession. They just fell through the cracks and disappeared from view. And I would guess that many people in this room, especially those on the older side, can think of some talented person who started out as a historian and was just pushed out and never heard from in the field again. And there was a method to the madness. It made a difference if you were simply a left academic or an activist. While there was some tolerance for the former, there was much less acceptance of, and is much less acceptance of a leftist who is also a public intellectual. Indeed, on that front, the norms of the profession have had a powerful impact. The poison pill, in my view, is the insistence on refereed journals. If you're publishing an article, no matter how boring or obscure, for an audience, no matter how small, this has a lot more to do with your promotion than if you write for a widely read local paper, or frankly, even in the New York Times. So there's been a powerful disincentive, which continues for left historians. There's a powerful disincentive for left historians to enter the public fray in any useful fashion. It also makes a difference what subfield you're in. If you're studying Latin America or you're a social or cultural historian today, there's a greater margin of tolerance. If your field is U.S. diplomatic history or U.S. foreign policy, the pressures are quite different. Of course, there are well-known revisionists, Walter Lefebvre, Lloyd Gardner, Gabriel Coco spring to mind, who have been taken seriously by their peers. It is noteworthy, however, that Coco is in Canada and has rarely been seen at a professional function. But when you look at the Society of Historians Foreign Relations, and I'm a member of that. I don't know if I'm in good standing or not, but if you look at that society in its totality, you find only a handful of people who are raising their voices in opposition to the horrendous role that the U.S. has played in the world in the aftermath of 9/11. Nor does the historical scholarship, even by revisionists today, nor does the historical scholarship have much critical sting, if we're honest about it. This is not merely a matter of self-selection. And now we get to the matter of my own career. And you know how people can go on and on about their own careers. I'm going to do it in a paragraph, so hang in, okay? So I just want to add in here my own experience as someone who studied the history of U.S. foreign policy. I left Dartmouth College in the mid-'70s to come to New York and teach at City University. And then I was a casualty of the budget crisis there and faced an array of problems finding a permanent job, but I'm going to skip them all, okay? Moving to 1978, I was hired at Stony Brook to replace David Trask, who had just become the official historian of the U.S. State Department. My selection was bitterly contested by the handful of Trask loyalists in the department who envisioned someone more mainstream, or certainly not me, for that position. Their objections and repeated interventions with the Stony Brook administration meant that every time I was voted the job, the position was redefined as temporary. In the space of 4 years, I participated in 3 national searches and 1 reappointment proceeding. That's 4 procedures. When I got to search 3, still full of energy and enthusiasm, as you might imagine, the administration alerted the department that if my name came up one more time, they would lose the line entirely. And at that point, I was fired and replaced by a conservative young man from Harvard who had not completed his doctorate. And I was actually still deciding if he wanted a career in the CIA. As is always the case, this was cloaked in other excuses. My research project was lacking in scholarly merit, although I had just been awarded an ACLS fellowship, and actually eventually Cambridge University Press would publish my book. But these were excuses. Of course, the question is, why were a handful of colleagues, and it was a minority, why were they able to block my appointment? Well, one reason was that they had the support of David Trask, a powerful historian at the State Department who still had influence with the Stony Brook administration. They also generated a pile of letters, the contents of which were never shared with the department. But some things about those letters were known, including that William Leuchtenberg, resurrected from the dead, apparently was recruited to write a letter to the Stony Brook administration about how I was a menace to the profession and outlining the nefarious role I had played in the Columbia strike 10 years before. And of course, there's also the fact that I had the William McNeill curse hanging over me, which is no small thing. Now, these events happened in 1980, and I did not obtain a full-time position as a historian until 1988. That I was able to come back at all was the result of assistance from some old friends, including Molly Nolan from this university, and the ever-loyal Eric McKittrick. I also had an incredible real estate break that helped me to fund my research at the last minute while I was unemployed. And I had 3 daughters, so that enabled me to convey the absolutely false impression that I was out of work because I had these children, as opposed to being out of work because people in my university had found me unfit to teach there. I'm here on this panel today because of these fortuitous circumstances. I was very, very lucky. But I have no doubt that for every case of someone like myself who just barely managed to squeak through, there were 20 other excellent people who disappeared from the profession. So what relevance does this have for the present? Is this truly history, and is Jesse's book just a period piece? Appearances to the contrary, I don't think political discrimination has disappeared. We don't hear very much about these cases. However, I'm almost certain that in regions of the country, and particularly in conservative regions of the country, in some fields of history, I mean, of course, Middle Eastern studies is a dangerous place to be, where an individual is a political activist as well as a scholar, that it's still very easy to push those people out on the grounds that their scholarship is lacking in quality or objectivity. In my own field of diplomatic history, it's very apparent that there remains a double standard, and that historians who express the conventional wisdom about the American past or simply equivocal and boring are likely to receive more attention and reward than their dissenting colleagues. That said, if one were to write a new book about conformity and coercion within our profession, I think it would need to be something quite different, and perhaps a careful look about how left historians became important within the profession by adopting some of the norms of their predecessors, and how in shrinking from the critical study of power or silencing ourselves in the face of great societal wrongs, we reproduced our own marginalization. But that's another subject for another time. I want to end my remarks by going back to Jesse's example. And as I was finishing this talk, and let me just say, like, I was still working at it at 3:45 because I never learned about deadlines or something's supposed to end, so I was struggling, and what am I going to say at the end? And just as that arrived, I had an email from a student that came just at that moment. This semester, I'm teaching a course on Vietnam, and in addition to talking about policy, I'm having all my students do oral histories with Vietnam vets. Okay, so arrives in my email just a moment ago, just a student email, and I just want to say in advance, it's kind of obnoxious that I'm reading it, but I'm not doing it to toot my own horn. Dear Professor, well, I just had to shoot you an email. I couldn't wait till class tomorrow. The interview with Jim, the Vietnam vet, was incredible. I mean, one of the most amazing things I've ever been a part of. He was one of the most genuine people I ever met. I went there with probably 30 questions at least, and I don't think I had to ask 5, with him answering 5 others involved in his answers. What I mean is, it was not a typical interview of question and answer. We just talked in conversation like two friends that had a lifetime of catching up to do. Throughout the interview, while we were talking, he had about 2 hours of video documentation of his time in Vietnam. After I left his home, I didn't know if I was going to just break down in tears or was motivated enough to run a marathon. The highs and lows were something I could never express to another person without, I could not do it justice. Thank you for allowing this opportunity to be presented to me. I'll remember this for the remainder of my life. And I think we hear in that the echo of somebody studying history from below. And I did survive William O'Neill's curse. And I think I've become the kind of teacher that gets students to do those things because Jesse Lemisch was that kind of teacher for me.
Wow, thank you, Rusti Eisenberg. That was wonderful. John McMillan is now assistant professor, history at Georgia State in Atlanta. Atlanta is this wild place doing incredible things. You connected to Emory and the new Civil Rights Archive there? Nope. Well, check it out. Check it out. John McMillan studies 20th century social movements, especially interested in New Left and youth culture, radicalism during the 60s. He is the author of Smoking Typewriters. Isn't that cool? The 60s Underground Press and the Rise of Alternative Media in America. He is founding co-editor of, I think, one of the very best journals that's out there, The 60s, a journal of history, politics, and culture. And you really should look at the 60s. It's online. They do great, great work. I'm going to ask you if your pal is back from London.
Michael?
Michael?
No, he's not back.
Not back. Well, that's really bad. We want him back. The 60s online. It's also published by Routledge since 2008. John has co-edited several scholarly anthologies, contributed short essays and book reviews to the Washington Post, The Nation, The Chronicle of Higher Education, New York Observer, Boston Globe, and The Believer. What's The Believer? John earned his PhD from Columbia in 2006. His dissertation was honored by the American Journalism Historians Association. His MA is from Michigan State University, 1996, and a BA from Michigan State's James Madison College. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi. It's super great to be here, so thank you very much. Thank you to Robbie for organizing this great panel. I'm honored to be a part of it. I just want to take a minute to say a bit about the important role that Jesse Lemisch played in my life. We met when I was first starting my graduate student experience at Columbia in sort of the mid to late 1990s. And I was really excited to start at Columbia, but then after I arrived, I was a little underwhelmed by the whole experience. I went on to have a very good time there, and it's a great blessing in my life. I had good relationships with my professors. But at first I felt a little bit lost. One of the first courses I took there was a research seminar on 20th century American history. And the goal of that class was to write an essay that would be publishable. And so this was my first time really delving into a lot of primary sources. And I was writing on the New Left. And you know, one of the things that struck me when I was going through this literature was that there was this consensus that the New Left was a highly anti-intellectual movement. And this is something you heard from people on both the left and the right. Paul Berman expressed this very well. He said, quote, "One must remember that the atmosphere of the New Left during the bad old days was not very congenial to intellectual work. Abolish brains was practically a slogan, though no one quite put it that way. Even left-wing brains came under suspicion." And at that same time, I was becoming aware of the work that was being done by some New Left scholars like Staughton and Jesse. And so I set out to not overturn, but to complicate this idea that the New Left was so anti-intellectual by looking at the work that they did. And I was interested in in what they produced. I was looking at their scholarship, but also at how they fashioned themselves as scholars. What was their sense of mission within the academy. And I was astonished and pleased to find out that Jesse lived just down the street from me. I didn't know that at first. And so he was about a 10-minute walk. And during my first couple of years at Columbia, we would meet pretty regularly. And we would talk about things. He would help me to refine my ideas. He read drafts of my work. He put me in touch with people that could be helpful. He said nice things about me. And he gave me a lot of confidence. And so he served as kind of an unofficial advisor. And I will always appreciate that. So thank you very much. So this is, you know, preparing for this panel, I reread On Active Service. This is the second time I read it very carefully. I agree with everyone here that this is really truly a classic in American historiography. The main argument here that you know, during the Cold War era, there were scholars who professed to be neutral and objective, you know, even as they put across, you know, very highly ideological worldviews that were hostile to radicalism. To me, this is irrefutable. And this essay is very carefully argued. It's meticulously documented, and it's also extraordinarily well written. I don't know if we've talked about this, but Jesse has a great prose style for this. I would hate to be on the other end of one of his polemics. Let's put it that way. Although if I keep supporting Obama, maybe one of these days, maybe one of these days I will be. What I thought I would do is speculate. I wanted to take Jesse's sort of framework and the template that he established and apply it to my own field, which is I study the New Left and youth culture in the 1960s, and I was thinking, you know, what would happen if I took some of Jesse's ideas and you know, saw how transferable they were to my field. And a few things have already come up in this discussion. We've talked about how radical historians in the 60s were in fact persecuted. They were fired, like Staughton and Jesse, or they were blacklisted. And then Jesse makes the important point, and Rusti, you just mentioned, you know, many more people presumably were simply just not hired. You know, people who were qualified, who would have, you know, served important roles in their programs were not given consideration as a result of their scholarship. I was wondering if that was the case today. Frankly, I'm not sure that we can say it. I mean, it seems likely that some of that may still go on, but everyone here is aware of the corporatization of higher education. Right now, about 25% of faculty members are tenured or on the tenure track. The other 75% are contingent laborers. They're lecturers or adjuncts. And I just think the hiring process is so, it's become capricious and arbitrary. It's hard to say who gets a job and who doesn't and why. I do know some left-wing scholars with impeccable credentials who I think should have jobs, but I know other people who should have jobs. You know, frankly, I would like a job in New York City. So, Ellen, if you ever have any lines open up for a post-war American historian, keep me in mind. You know, another theme that I thought I discerned in this book, I wondered if there was a generational conflict going on. And Jesse said, you know, that's not really what he was trying to imply, but the fact is, You know, in 1969, when this essay was, when he read this essay, he was attacking mostly senior scholars in the profession, and he drew support, I think, mostly from younger scholars. And you know, this was interesting to me because, you know, in my field, the academic study of the 60s, this was an issue of concern for a lot of people. There was some, you know, not too long ago, people were talking about whether or not, you know, the senior scholars in this field are, you know, these are the people who write about the 60s were also people who lived through the 60s, and they make hiring decisions, they award prizes, they referee journal articles, and David Farber, who is a real pioneer in my field, in 2000 wrote an essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education, alleging that, he said, quote, "Too many professional gatekeepers have resisted letting young scholars challenge their memories, criticize their generation, or simply explain their experience in unfamiliar contexts." And I'm really not sure how much this is the case today. I mean, some of the so-called sort of younger scholars in my field by this point have been around long enough that they're starting to exert an influence in the field, and that's nice to see. But I can say that there are cases where people have suggested that they occupied a kind of privileged vantage as a result of their personal experience. I just want to read an actual email that I received. About a month ago, I was on C-SPAN. I was promoting my book, Smoking Typewriters, and I got this delightful email. It said, for a guy named Gerald Jackman from Santa Barbara. Dear John, I hold a PhD in history received probably before you were born. I lived the 60s, and my impression from watching you on C-SPAN is that you don't know shit about the 60s. You go to City Lights, and they throw nothing but softballs, yada, yada, yada. Your appearance at City Lights seemed very much like a circle jerk. So, it's not unheard of for scholars to take that viewpoint. You know, but most importantly, I wanted to look at the. My notes are out of order here. Excuse me. You know, some of the scholarship that's been done in my field. When you look at the study of the New Left over the last 20 years, I do think you see a bit of an anti-radical bias. I would say that Todd Gitlin and James Miller are both the scholars whose works are on graduate student reading lists. They were, you know, 20 years ago their works on the New Left came out, but they still are widely read. I think they have a lot to recommend them. These are good books in many respects, but there's something really ironic to me about the fact that the 60s is associated with this populist ethos that we can, you know, better understand history in many cases by looking at it from the bottom up, in Jesse's phrase, and yet many chroniclers of the New Left have been disappointingly top down in their approach, and there's been a tendency among some of these scholars to dwell far too much, I think, on the institutional history of SDS, on the movement as it occurred in large cities, and on the powerful personalities of key movement leaders. And SDS, of course, was important, but the New Left was a very broad-based movement. And so in my book, in Smoking Typewriters, I tried to correct for some of these distortions by studying the New Left through the prism of the underground press. And these underground newspapers are interesting because they existed in every pocket of the country, not just in large cities. And it was the nature of these papers that they were highly accessible. They were very democratic. Anyone who wanted to contribute could you know, lay a claim on the attention of the movement in their community by writing for an underground newspaper. So I thought my approach had certain advantages in that this top-down, you know, institutional approach that we see in my field, I think it leaves too much out. And someone else said that, you know, quote, there were many centers of action in the movement, many actions, many interpretations, many visions, and many experiences. And I think that a younger generation of scholars is beginning to honor that. There's a real movement towards social history in my subfield. It's also the case that the writing on the New Left perhaps pays too much favorable attention to the early New Left. The narrative that we're familiar with holds that the New Left began more or less in 1962 with the Port Huron Statement, and that movement's architects were you know, very bright young people who gleaned their ideas about participatory democracy from their encounters with social theorists like C. Wright Mills and the Civil Rights Movement. And as some scholars, you know, besides myself, have pointed out, this early phase is sometimes romanticized as sort of the good 60s. But in fact, that wasn't when a lot was accomplished in the movement. It wasn't until later on, when the New Left was a broad-based mass movement, that it had its greatest effect. And then meanwhile, these same scholars may dwell over much, I think, on the so-called bad 60s. That's the period when activists were flirting with, outlandish revolutionary rhetoric, and they were retreating into hedonism and drug abuse and subjecting their opponents to, scurrilous and dehumanizing rhetoric, and at the extreme engaging in political violence that was maybe unwise and immoral in some cases. That narrative is pretty firmly implanted in my field. And that suggests that the movement was over by about 1969 or 1970. I don't think that's the case. And I think this framework may betray a certain amount of anti-radical bias. I see some merit in it. I see what they're driving at. But in this framework, the people who are most critical of the U.S. and its role in the world, the people who were most critical of capitalism and its logic, are seen as sort of black sheep. And then finally, concomitant to this, we've seen an outpouring, I think, of very good writing on the New Left recently, but we've seen very little work that's been done on the counterculture that I think is worth very much. When I teach my classes on the 60s, I'm always forced to use memoirs in order to talk about the counterculture, and I wonder if this can be accounted for in part by a certain timidity among scholars in my field, or a failure of imagination. The one very good book on the counterculture that I like is by a professor at Amherst named Nick Bramell. It's called Tomorrow Never Knows, and he set out to understand drug consciousness in the 1960s, and he argued that there's something rigorous and instructive about the experience of getting stoned and listening to music as if it really mattered. And although millions of people in the 60s listened to rock with the help of psychedelics, this phenomenon has been unexplored. It's just a very good book. It was published by the University of Chicago Press. He's a tenured professor, and it did not get a single review, and it didn't get a review in the Journal of American History or American Historical Review or Reviews in American History. Nick Bramell, B-R-O-M-E-L-L. And then until recently, just incidentally, Noam Chomsky's books were not reviewed in any of these journals. As recently as 2005, at that point he had written 30 books. None of them have been reviewed in any of the major journals. And so all this, I guess what I want to suggest here today, just wrapping up, is that I think it's very useful to approach this book through a bifurcated lens. On the one hand, it's a cultural artifact from a time when historians approached their work with a keen sense of political mission, in an environment that was very hostile, and a great personal sacrifice. And so Jesse and Staughton and others, emerge as saintly figures and as heroes, I think, from these pages. And then I think this book also, resonates, and it continues to have relevance. He's provided a kind of template or a model that American historians can use today to understand, what's going on in their own professions. Jesse did some of that work himself in his remarks, and I found it, useful to apply his framework or his rubric to my subfield. It was edifying for me, and so I encourage you guys to read this book. And thanks again.
Time for comments and questions, and is there anything that you want to say by way of, or should we just go right to comments and questions?
Yeah, I want to thank Jesse for all his work and for that wonderful presentation, and also to let him know I'm teaching a class this semester on women's history, and we've come up to the present, and we read this wonderful piece in the Feminist Memoir Project, part of it by Naomi. And all of my students, all these 20 women, have fallen deeply in love with you. They cannot believe that at this point there was ever a husband, the way she talks about you, as being so supportive. They keep saying, but how can a man be like that? So I just want to convey to you, and please convey to Naomi as well, what a thrilling example you are to a generation of 20-year-old Orthodox Jewish women.
At Stern College, Yeshiva University. That is wonderful. Thank you.
That's really very sweet. Let me just add here that I'm one of the few men whose biography appears in Barbara Love's Feminists Who Changed America, an encyclopedia. And I'm listed there because I'm one of 7,000 people or thereabouts who taught the first course on women in America. That is, I think there are about 7,000 claimants for that title.
And one is Naomi, who taught the first.
Pardon?
Naomi taught the first course in Women in America.
Well, her career was so horribly mistreated that
Right.
no, she did not have that opportunity until later on.
Okay. You know that. Yeah.
Yeah, this is for,
Can I
I
get,
believe,
see if I can move this around?
There's a mic right there.
yeah.
There's a mic in the crowd.
Okay.
The right way to address you is Professor Lynd, right? Okay. Are you really so upset about the killing of bin Laden? Like,
Because he was unarmed, I don't know quite what is meant by preparing to resist, threatening to resist. And we're still learning a lot about what actually happened there, and that's why I think the bombing of Gaddafi's family 30 years ago and now again today is a more solid example. But I'm, yeah, I mean, the rhetoric was we were going to kill him or bring him to justice, right? And if there was a genuine opportunity to bring him to justice, I think that would have been far preferable and more consistent with our alleged values as a society.
well, yeah, but I mean, wouldn't even killing him be bringing him to justice in this case? I mean, we're talking about Osama bin Laden. It's you know, it's not just it's not just a petty criminal.
Who we assume is the person who ordered September 9th, 2011, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it would be good to have a little courtroom type evidence of that. I think it's almost certainly true.
I mean, he admitted it, but
Pardon?
I believe he admitted it. He did.
Well, I think he certainly took, I mean, others here I'm sure may know more than I about it. My impression is that he thought it was a good thing that it happened. He appears to have known in advance that it was going to happen. Exactly what his role was, I don't know, and I've not seen that clarified elsewhere.
Okay.
David, what's
Thank you.
your
Okay, I'm
impression?
going to move on. Yes,
I was going to raise my hand to make a comment on that.
David.
The thing
This
which
is
occurs-
David McReynolds of the War Resisters League, our
The thing that
hero.
occurs to me is less whether he was killed properly or not. And I agree with you, we should have had him brought to trial. But he was killed in a country that is sovereign and not at the invitation of that country. It was a targeted assassination. Now, I don't know how one feels about targeted assassinations. I'm opposed to them categorically across the board. I'm in favor of judicial actions where you bring someone to trial. That was not the intent of Obama, it was not the intent of Bush, and that's not what happened. So my objection is to the fact that it was a targeted assassination by the admission of the president. I'm not making it up.
Right.
I
I
think we
think
should-
all of us who care about the rule of law are ultimately going to have to confront the routinization of torture, of Abu Ghraib, of Guantanamo. Is this okay? Does the U.S. really stand for this, or does the U.S. have some fantasy that it will go back to the rule of law, which it has long since abandoned? I think this is a great crisis in our moment, and it's a great crisis as we go forward. I mean, does this mean we'll stop the drone attacks in Afghanistan, where who are we killing in villages and hamlets? I mean, who are we killing? And this is true for Iraq as well. And you know, Rusti mentioned Schaefer. The new president of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations is Marilyn Young. Marilyn Young of NYU, who is such a great pioneering historian of the war in Vietnam. I tell everybody to go on commondreams.org because that's where you can get Al Jazeera in English, Haaretz in English, Der Spiegel in English every single day, Democracy Now!, commondreams.org from around the country and around the world. And there's a group of people, veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, led by a guy named Ray McGovern and Ray Close, and they are the great peace journalists and activists who had been head of station in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, and so on. So, I mean, there's a lot that we need to learn. There's a lot that we need to read. The good news is, so far we have a free press, and commondreams.org is an access to that. Yes?
Well, I wanted to thank Jesse for his article years ago about riding sailors through the Revolutionary period. One of my fun articles I read many years ago. But I wanted to ask the panel a question about the popularization of history we're seeing in our society. I go every year to a conference that's funded by the TV industry called History Makers that occurs where all the different people who buy history documentaries in Europe and the United States come to talk about what they're doing and what they're shaping. And I wanted to get your impression about what you think about that, because documentaries right now are ever increasing in their popularity. They're being gobbled up by the TV stations and the networks throughout the country. What do you make of the way that history is being presented in recent years through phenomena like the History Channel and elsewhere?
Well, if I may answer that, I have
Into the mic.
I've long tried to make sense of what's going on in documentary and have had many criticisms to make. There's a lot to be said, but PBS had, well, there were two documentaries on the Triangle Fire. One was on PBS and maybe the other was on HBO, I'm not sure. And one of the things that struck me was the either historians have avoided participation in such a thing, in such stuff, or the documentary filmmakers think that the worst thing in the world is to put historians on camera. And what we saw was really, to me, a kind of a stunning kind of presentation in which the descendants of the victims of the Triangle Fire recited what had happened, and somehow it seemed to want to convey that they were there. Thus, there was no notion that there might be some intermediary who might study it and say, okay, this was what it was about, this was not what it was about. So the historian in me was really upset by that. In general, I worry about documentaries and the ideas that are presented through documentary. And I have been critical of many left documentaries, which I see as having those kinds of problems, sanctification of the subject, et cetera, et cetera. And I found that over the years, even using the term subject in the left is a little offensive because people are not supposed to be the subject. They're supposed to be the makers of history and so on and so forth. So I don't know where to go with that. I think it's important to have documentaries about history. I'm always interested in new accounts of World War II bombing on the History Channel, which seems to be what the History Channel is mainly about. I could long for more stuff about submarine warfare. They don't seem to be very sharp on that. So I don't know where to go with that. But yes, of course, it's positive that there should be history documentaries. But how they are done should be thought about very critically, I think. It is where a lot of people are getting their history from, and it's not necessarily true.
Yeah. Please.
It was mentioned earlier, this concept of democracy in education, and I, having gone through searching through colleges, I've noticed that it seems to be the wealthier colleges that I personally couldn't afford that are more willing to offer these sort of small seminar-type courses where democracy can be practiced in education, while at the same time it seems ironic that it is these more well-funded universities that are willing to offer this, whereas public universities might be willing to offer them but simply don't have the facilities. I wonder if there's any comments you might have on that kind of concept or the influence of the left in the creation of democracy in the education, how it's maybe been hijacked by a more commercial college system.
Are you asking me or the panel? Or?
The
panel.
Anyone who has an answer. Any comments?
I just want to say a word about the incredible assault on education going on around the country, both the closing of public schools and the closing of public higher education. I just came back from the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, which until this year had been very well funded in the law school, in the women's studies department, and they were closing the women's studies department. They were firing people. Everybody's at risk. And this is the University of Nevada. I mean, you know, we think of it as the home of gambling and money. So very scary. Here at the State University, they've closed entire departments at Albany and Stony Brook, fired everybody with tenure and without in languages, in French, Spanish, and German. So a lot of things are going on. At the City University, we have a wonderful union, and we're going to protest tomorrow, hoping that we will, our protest and our folks in the street will, you know, make a difference. But it's very scary. And if you look at what is replacing public schools, you find that in state after state, village after village, it's fundamentalist religious schools, literally fundamentalist religious schools that are replacing public education. So we're in a very scary and creepy moment. And as Jesse, I think it was, who said we need many Wisconsins, or did Staughton say that? One of them said we need many Wisconsins and many Tahrir squares, and that's what we need. We need to be organized, and we need to get out there, and it's going to be all up to you. Yeah. And we've left you a terrible world, and I'm really sorry.
I don't personally blame anyone on the panel. But,
well, we did the best we could.
Yeah, I'm personally at the University of Pittsburgh, which just recently Governor Corbett has promised to cut at least 50% of the state funding. So this is a pretty personal issue, because I might not have been able to go to school had he done it 2 years ago.
Very, very creepy. Yeah. Do you want to say something about that, John? Is it? Okay. Moving forward. Somebody else. Was there a hand over here? I thought I saw.
Let me just, since people, I don't see any other hands up, let me just throw in a comment without personalizing this, though it's become quite personalized, and I'm grateful to everybody, immensely grateful. Staughton's words about courage. Movements ennoble people. When the movements decline, we find out who they really were and who they are, and that may be connected somewhat to the unnamed left academics that Rusti mentioned in passing, that they surfaced as entrepreneurs, which is where they were headed to be before a movement came along and ennobled them. So I entered the movement a deviant, and I remain a deviant, but I do believe that what's taken for courage, and thank you, has to be seen in the context of rising movements which ennoble us and enable us to do things like some of the things that have been mentioned here. May they come again.
May they come again. Let me just say two things. Tonight we're competing with a really very moving memorial service for Giuliano Mayor Camis, who was killed. He was the founder of the Jenin, Jenin, and you can go online and see interviews with Giuliano Mercamis. He was assassinated in front of his theater. This is a children's theater in Jenin. It brought lots and lots of hope to this embattled community, and that his memorial is tonight, and Tony Kushner is going to be there, and Kathleen Chalfant. I would have been there because I love Giuliano. And we support the Jenin Freedom Theater. I hope you all will. But today was the day we learned that there was this guy, Wiesenfeld, no relation, okay? I didn't shorten the name, who threw a fit at the Board of Trustees at the City University and said, we at John Jay cannot give Tony Kushner an honorary degree. And this, of course, is Tony Kushner, one of our greatest playwrights. And why can't we give him an honorary degree, according to this guy? Because he is unacceptable in his views on Israel-Palestine. Well, his views on Israel-Palestine are about peace and justice. There will be no peace unless there's some activity for justice. You know, there is something about the occupied territories. But his book, Wrestling with Zion, which I have a chapter in, is a very important book that he edited with Elisa Solomon. And you know, these are people who stand up, and it's becoming harder and harder to stand up, as somebody earlier said, on, you know, what's not acceptable in New York right now. Well, one thing that's not acceptable is to talk about the Nakba, to talk about Palestine. There's an ad in yesterday's paper. There was no such thing as Palestine. I mean, excuse me? Anyway, so here we are with the facts of our history totally embattled. And I think Jesse and I first met, maybe we all first met, when we founded the Peace History Society, which was then called the Conference on Peace Research and History. And we, in 1969, tried to get the AHA to protest the war in Vietnam, and came face to face with this notion that historians are objective and they don't take stands. We've all related to that. Yes?
Well, I'm just curious to get an idea from the panel as to where they think the state of academic history is now, given the kind of comments they've been making. For example, when one goes to AHA meetings, you sort of seem like, it's like, you know, I have friends of mine who always describe it as, you know, well, here's this tribe, here's that tribe, here's the social history tribe, here's the political tribe, here's the diplomatic history tribe, here's all these different tribes. And where's synthesis? How much of this do you, and the growth of the memory schools, how much of this do you think is reflecting, as anyone who looks at historiographical analyses from a historical point of view knows, it reflects a certain trend in time? What are we living through right now with the kind of things that are going on in the history press?
I have a comment about that because I had the opportunity to rerun Rip Van Winkle's experience. After 1969, or shortly thereafter, I was done when it came to getting a position to teach history, so I became a lawyer, and I've been a lawyer since then. But in 2003, I was invited back to a gathering of left historians on the period of the American Revolution. So as I say, it was like Rip Van Winkle. I didn't find a rusty firearm by my side, but otherwise it was pretty close. A couple of impressions. I find the field of history astonishingly the same as it was when I said goodbye, or it said goodbye to me 40 years ago. I mean, the same endless biographies of great white men, for example. Once in a while, somebody waves at the reality of slavery. Gordon Wood called it a dark shadow over American history in that period, but people haven't really internalized the fact. that this society came into being by enslaving black people and murdering red people. It just is not sufficiently central.